All right, so get this. Did you know there is a U.S. territory where the Constitution applies, but nobody actually lives there?
It's true. We're going on a deep dive today into U.S. territories, the places beyond the 50 states.
Yeah, and we've got this really interesting source that breaks down all the different types. Bustling islands, practically deserted atolls, the whole shebang.
Oh, it's a wild ride, let me tell you. You might be surprised how diverse and complex these territories actually are.
So, okay, we all know the 50 states, but our source is like, hold on, there's a whole lot more to the U.S. map than that.
Right off the bat, there's Washington, D.C., the nation's capital.
Hmm.
But it's not a state. It's directly controlled by Congress.
And that brings up a pretty big debate, right?
Hmm.
D.C. residents can't vote for president even though their population is bigger than some states.
Yeah, it's a question of representation. People who support D.C. statehood say it's unfair that residents pay taxes, even serve in the military, but can't vote for president. But then opponents argue that D.C. was never meant to be a state, and making one would mess with the balance of power that the founding fathers, envisioned.
It's a real political hot potato. Okay, ready for this? There are over 300 Native American reservations in the U.S.
That's right, and they cover a huge amount of land.
Larger than some countries, our source says.
About 3% of all the land in the U.S., and there are about 10 million people living on them.
Wow. That's a lot of people who live, under different rules than the rest of us.
You got to remember, these reservations aren't just pieces of land. They're sovereign nations within the U.S. They've got their own governments, make their own laws, even regulate businesses on their land.
The source really emphasizes that, how these reservations are super autonomous, even though technically under U.S. jurisdiction.
Exactly. The relationship between the U.S. government and the tribes is based on treaties and agreements. It's like nations within a nation.
Super interesting. And there's a lot of variety in how these reservations are run, too, right? The source talks about rancherias in California and pueblos in New Mexico.
It's all about the different cultures and histories of the tribes. Over time, they've developed their own governments, legal systems, you name it.
So it's way more complex than just looking at reservations as dots on a map.
Definitely. You need to understand the history, the treaties, and the ongoing struggles for self-determination that shape life on the reservations.
Okay, so we've got D.C., we've got hundreds of sovereign nations within the U.S. What about Puerto Rico? What's its deal?
Puerto Rico is officially classified as an organized, unincorporated territory.
Okay, what does that even mean?
Basically, organized means it has a government set up by Congress, but unincorporated means it's not on track to become a state, kind of stuck in between.
So self-governing, but still under U.S. control.
Yep. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, but they can't vote in presidential elections unless they move to a state.
That doesn't seem very fair, especially considering they have almost 4 million people living there.
I know, right? That's more than 21 states.
Exactly.
The whole question of Puerto Rican statehood has been debated forever. Some people say it's a matter of basic rights,
Makes sense.
but others worry about what it would do to the economy or their culture. And then some people in Puerto Rico actually want full independence instead.
It's a super complicated issue. And speaking of islands, there are other U.S. territories in the Pacific too, right?
Yeah, there's Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, and the U.S. Virgin Islands,
Yeah.
all organized and unincorporated, just like Puerto Rico.
Okay, so they have their own governments, but limited voting rights. Got it.
Oh, how did it?
But I'm guessing they each have their own story, right?
For sure. Take Guam, for example.
Mm.
Super important strategically for the U.S. military, being out there in the Western Pacific. It actually became a U.S. territory after the Spanish-American War back in 1898.
Interesting. So its history is really tied up with U.S. military strategy.
Exactly. And there's this ongoing debate about how to balance that strategic importance with what the people who live there want. Plus, they have the same voting restrictions.
So there are definitely some downsides to being a U.S. territory. We've got these organized territories with governments, but our source also mentioned unorganized territories. What are those all about?
Yeah, the unorganized, unincorporated territories. Mostly smaller islands, many of them uninhabited,
Like
Baker Island, Howland Island, Jarvis Island.
Okay, uninhabited. Why are they even U.S. territories, then?
Most are managed by the Department of the Interior. They're like wildlife refuges or have some historical significance. Take Midway Atoll, for instance. It's a peaceful bird sanctuary now.
Right.
But it was the site of a huge World War II battle, actually a turning point in the Pacific.
Wow, so even these tiny islands played a role in U.S. history. Crazy.
It really shows how far U.S. influence reaches. Even the most remote places can be connected to the bigger picture.
So we've got organized territories with governments. Unorganized ones that are basically nature preserves. Then there's this thing called Palmyra Atoll,
Palmyra Atoll, yeah.
the only unorganized incorporated U.S. territory.
Now that one's interesting. See, when Hawaii became a state, Palmyra Atoll, which used to be grouped with Hawaii, didn't get included. So because of that, it ended up in this weird category where the U.S. Constitution technically applies, but there's nobody living there to govern.
It's like a U.S. territory where the rules exist, but there's nobody to follow them.
Exactly. Shows how those legal lines can get kind of blurry when it comes to U.S. territories.
This is blowing my mind. And then there's American Samoa. It's unorganized and unincorporated, but it has a local government and its own constitution.
American Samoa is another exception.
Yeah.
It basically runs itself way more than those truly unorganized territories. They elect their own officials, have their own constitution.
So it's like barely a territory at all.
Not quite. It still has a unique relationship with the U.S., its own history. Makes you wonder if our system of classifying these territories is even accurate anymore. It's a good question to think about.
This whole deep dive is making me realize how complex U.S. territories really are. So many different ways they're governed, so many different ways they relate to the U.S.
It's like peeling back layers of a map, revealing all these stories, all these connections.
It's fascinating. I'm hooked. So where do we go from here? What else is there to uncover in this world of U.S. territories? I can't wait to find out. It really is like a whole hidden world, right? We were talking about how Puerto Rico has a larger population than 21 states.
Yeah. And you know what? Our source points out that Puerto Rico actually makes up like almost 90% of the people living on U.S.-controlled islands. Not counting Hawaii, of course.
That's wild. No wonder there's so much debate about statehood.
It's a big deal. The people pushing for statehood, they see it as like a basic fairness issue. Puerto Ricans deserve the same rights, same representation as any other U.S. citizen.
Makes sense. But it's not that simple, is it? What are some of the concerns people have about statehood for Puerto Rico?
Well, some people worry about the economy. You know, Puerto Rico has its own tax status right now, and that could change if it becomes a state.
Right.
And then some people are concerned about what it would mean for their culture, their language.
So it's about preserving their identity.
Exactly.
Huh.
And we can't forget, there are also people in Puerto Rico who want full independence. They see that as the only way to really control their own destiny.
It's a complicated issue, that's for sure. We were talking about Guam earlier, how it's so important for the U.S. military. Does that create any tension?
Definitely. Guam's location makes it, like, crucial for U.S. operations in the Pacific. But for the people who live there, it can be tough. Some worry about the environment, the impact of all the military activity.
I can imagine.
And there's always the risk that Guam could become a target if there's ever a conflict in the region.
Right. It's like they're stuck between, I don't know, Guam's strategic importance and just wanting to live in peace.
Yeah. It's a tough balance. And it's even harder because, well, Guam residents don't have full voting rights, just like other territories, even though they have to follow U.S. laws and, you know, could be called on to serve in the military.
It's like they don't have a say in decisions that could, like, directly affect their lives.
Yeah, exactly. You see that tension in Guam between U.S. interests and the people who live there. It makes you think.
It really does. This whole conversation is so eye-opening. It's easy to forget that there are real people living in these territories. They're not just places on a map.
It's crucial to remember that. We're talking about millions of people living on reservations, for instance.
Right.
Facing challenges with poverty, healthcare, even preserving their cultures and languages.
Makes you think about the legacy of, you know, colonization, displacement. Those effects are still being felt today.
Absolutely. But our source also talks about how resilient these communities are. They're working to revitalize their languages, strengthen their economies, you know, really take control of their own futures.
That's amazing. What about those other Pacific territories, like the Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa? What are some of the issues they face?
Well, a lot of these island communities struggle with economic development, climate change, and just trying to keep their cultures alive in a world that's, like, getting more and more globalized.
It's easy to think about island life as paradise, but it's not always that simple.
Definitely not. Rising sea levels, for example. That's a huge threat to a lot of these islands.
Yeah.
And many of them depend on tourism, which can be very unpredictable. They're vulnerable to economic changes, global events.
Even paradise can be fragile, huh?
It really can. It makes you realize how important sustainable development is and how important it is to respect the cultures and environments of these unique places.
So we've talked about representation, strategic importance, the challenges people face. But what about those uninhabited territories, those tiny islands, like lost in the middle of the Pacific.
Those are interesting, aren't they? Almost like forgotten by time.
Right. What's the point of the U.S. even having them if nobody lives there? It's almost like a collecting thing, just claiming these little pieces of land in case they're useful someday.
Yeah, there might be some strategic or economic reasons behind it,
Hmm.
but it also raises questions about environmental responsibility, right?
Right.
Even if nobody lives there, those islands are part of delicate ecosystems that need to be protected.
So it's about more than just owning them. It's about being responsible for them.
Exactly.
Mm.
The U.S. has a duty to manage those territories in a way that protects the environment and makes sure those ecosystems stay healthy for the long term.
I guess even the smallest, most remote U.S. territories can teach us something about how we treat the environment and how connected everything really is.
Yeah, it really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? These tiny islands that most people have never even heard of, but they can tell us so much about, well, everything, history, the environment, our role in the world. It's fascinating.
Totally. It shows that even the places that seem insignificant can actually have a big impact. And speaking of impact, we've uncovered a lot in this deep dive. So many different kinds of U.S. territories. But I'm still thinking about those disputed territories we touched on earlier, like the ones with Colombia and Haiti.
Yeah.
What's going on with those?
Well, a lot of those disputes come from old claims,
Yeah.
historical stuff. Sometimes it's about how people interpret treaties or they disagree about maritime boundaries.
So it's like a real-life game of Risk, but with way higher stakes.
Exactly. And those disputes can have a big impact on things like resource rights, who gets to use what,
Mm-hmm.
and even national security, not to mention the people who actually live in those areas.
Wow. It's a reminder that everything's connected, even when we don't realize it.
Yeah.
And what about those territories with, what was it called, free association status?
Association, yeah.
You mentioned Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. I thought those were independent nations.
They are. They have their own governments, make their own decisions. But they've also got these agreements with the U.S. Basically, they get things like economic help, and their citizens can live and work in the U.S. And in exchange, the U.S. takes care of certain things for them, like defense.
So it's kind of like they're independent, but also connected to the U.S. in a way.
Exactly. It's a way for those nations to be in charge of their own affairs, but still have those benefits from the relationship with the U.S. A win-win, you could say.
It's amazing how many different kinds of relationships there are between the U.S. and these territories.
It just shows you how complex global politics can be.
So we've talked about representation, strategic importance, the challenges people face. What about the future of these territories? What do you think it holds?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Only time will tell.
Yeah.
But I think we can be pretty sure that the relationship between the U.S. and its territories is going to keep changing.
How so?
Oh, all sorts of factors, political movements, the economy, even climate change.
Our source mentioned the possibility of Puerto Rico becoming a state.
The 51st state.
That would be a huge deal, right?
Definitely. That debate's not going away anytime soon. But at the end of the day, it's up to the people of Puerto Rico to decide. It's their future.
And what about those free association territories? Could things change there, too?
Yeah, those agreements are designed to be flexible. As things change, they can adapt. I imagine there will be conversations, adjustments, whatever it takes to make sure everyone's needs are met.
So the future of U.S. territories is like full of possibilities. Good and bad, I guess.
For sure. And the important thing to remember is that we're not just talking about places on a map. We're talking about people.
Right.
Different cultures, different ways of life.
If there's one thing you want our listeners to take away from this deep dive, what would it be?
I'd say it's this. U.S. territories are complex. They're not all the same. They have their own histories, their own cultures, and they all want different things for their future. And their relationship with the mainland is always changing, always evolving.
So it's about more than just knowing where these territories are on a map. It's about understanding the people, their stories, and how everything fits together.
You got it. I hope this deep dive has sparked some curiosity in our listeners. I hope they keep learning, keep asking questions, because there's so much to discover about U.S. territories, and it's definitely worth the effort.
Great point. To all our listeners out there, I encourage you, keep digging, keep learning, keep questioning. We've just scratched the surface here. The world of U.S. territories is full of surprises, and it's a journey you won't regret taking.